This is a warning. Once you step into this ICU, you might never look at hospitals the same way again. Hit subscribe and dive into a story that will haunt you long after you leave. The night had fallen, and the ICU was quiet. The only sounds that filled the air were the soft beeping of monitors and the distant hum of machines. It was supposed to be just another night shift, the kind of shift that became routine for Nurse Lydia, someone who had seen it all. The near-death experiences, the dramatic rescues, and the tragic losses. Lydia froze in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. She had been working in this ICU for years. Exhaustion could play tricks on the mind, especially after a long shift. But the cry grew louder, more insistent, and it was impossible to ignore. It was coming from down the hall, room 312, to be precise. She checked the chart, confirming that no infants had been admitted recently. There was no reason for the cry to exist. Whispers began to circulate around the ICU. Nurses shared stories of hearing a baby crying in the dead of night, always coming from that same part of the unit. Lydia realized it was something far darker. The baby's spirit, or perhaps the echoes of its pain, were still trapped in that room. And every time Lydia passed by, she could feel it, an oppressive weight in the air. They said that late at night. When the unit was silent, ghost stories were just that story. But then, one night, after receiving a cryptic message on her pager, Lydia started to question everything. They could see her ghost walking the halls in her scrubs, her face a somber expression, as if still watching over the patients. Others said they could feel her presence, an unmistakable chill in the air, a strange heaviness in the room, a sense of sorrow that lingered in the walls. The memory of the child's struggle, the grief of the family, and the heart-wrenching sound of that faint cry seemed to haunt the very room. Some dismissed it as a trick of the mind, stress. Her mother had passed away just weeks before, and no one at the hospital knew the specifics of her death. It was too personal, too specific to be a coincidence. She dismissed it at first, thinking it was just a malfunction, but the messages kept coming, more urgent this time. You're in room 305. It wasn't the first time she'd felt it in the ICU, but this time it was different. The other nurses reported similar experiences. The sensation of being in the presence of something that shouldn't be there, something unseen. The nurses spoke of shadowy figures, of inexplicable cold spots that appeared on the ward in the dead of night. But it wasn't until the stories converged, when Lydia realized that many others had experienced the same eerie sensations, that she started to question whether it was just the stress of working in such a high-pressure environment, or if something more sinister was at play, or perhaps an acoustic illusion caused by the building's strange architecture. But then, a senior nurse shared a chilling detail, and yet it had been so real, so vivid. The baby had passed away in room 312. The crying that the nurses had heard began shortly after that tragic night. Lydia's pulse quickened, and her mind raced for an explanation. Was it stress, a sensory overload from exhaustion, or something else? Megan, a nurse who had worked in the ICU years ago, had tragically died in a car accident. She had been driving back to work after a long shift when her car crashed, taking her life. It was a terrible loss, one that rocked the staff to its core, and babies were never brought in at this hour. This was an adult ICU after all, where the majority of patients were elderly and suffering from critical conditions. Yet the cry persisted, faint but undeniable. But tonight, as she walked to the familiar sterile corridors of the ICU, something felt different. As Lydia made her rounds, she passed a room where an elderly man had been resting quietly for days. The machines were steady, and he showed no signs of improvement. It was a long night, and Lydia's tired eyes were already feeling the weight of exhaustion. But then, something caught her attention, faint at first, but unmistakable. A baby's cry. It wasn't loud, nor was it panicked, but it was clear and sorrowful. Lydia hesitated, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. The hallway was dimly lit, and as Lydia walked toward the room, a shiver ran down her spine. She reached for the handle, opened the door, and stepped inside. The room was empty, no baby, no sign of life, just the usual ICU equipment. Monitors, IV drips, and an untouched bed. A cold wave of unease washed over her as she stood there, staring at the empty room. Later, she would learn that she wasn't the only one to hear the cry. Other nurses had experienced it too. Months earlier, a newborn had been admitted to the ICU in critical condition. Despite the best efforts of the staff, it wasn't just fatigue. As the days passed, Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Lydia's unease grew as she continued her shifts, And it wasn't long before a new story surfaced, one that chilled her to the bone. The rumors about Megan didn't stop there, though. Some of the older nurses whispered that Megan's spirit still haunted the ICU at first. Lydia didn't believe it. The message read, "Is your mother okay? I'm here." Lydia's blood ran cold. Her mother had passed away just weeks before, and no one at the hospital knew the specifics of her death. It was too personality specific to be a coincidence. Room 305. The very room she had been assigned to that night, checking on a patient who had just passed away. She dismissed it at first, thinking it was just a malfunction, but the messages kept coming, more urgent this time. "You're in room 305. They had come from nowhere, but after hearing the nurse's words, some said they'd seen shadows in the corners of their eyes, a place where the dead never truly left, and the past refused to fade away. Fleeting glimpses of figures that disappeared when they turned to look. She couldn't help but wonder, was it exhaustion, stress, or something much more sinister that was at play here? Something beyond the scope of medical science. The answers remained elusive, but one thing was certain: whatever lingered in the ICU was no ordinary presence, and it would continue to haunt her, just as it haunted the other nurses, who dared to walk its silent halls. Others spoke of a deep sense of dread that would suddenly wash over them, usually in the quietest hours of the night. Things hidden just beneath the surface, things that shouldn't be forgotten. The shadowy figures, the inexplicable cold spots, the cries that no one could explain, they were all a part of the hospital's eerie history. Lydia began to wonder, was Megan's spirit trying to reach out to her? Lydia's heart raced. She found one of the senior nurses, an older woman who had been with the hospital for years. The nurse looked at her gravely and spoke in a hushed tone. "That is where Megan worked her last shift," as if the room had absorbed the sorrow, the grief, and the lingering presence of something unfinished. She checked the patient's vitals and tried to shake off the feeling. But there it was again, the sense that something unseen was watching her. She died that night, on her way back to the hospital. Some of us think she's still here, watching over the unit. The cold chill that had settled in Lydia's spine deepened. She had been in room 305 all night, and the messages. Later that week, Lydia returned to room 305 to check on another patient. The air felt thick. It wasn't just the rooms, though there was something about the ICU itself. The entire unit felt like it held secrets. Lydia wasn't the only one who had these experiences. Several other nurses had reported similar incidents. But perhaps the most unsettling part of all was the sensation of being watched. It was as if the ICU itself was alive as Lydia continued to work in the ICU. The air in the ICU was thick with tension. It was just past midnight, and the usual hum of life-saving machines created a steady backdrop to the quiet murmurs of nurses moving between rooms. Nurse Sarah had been on the night shift for over a year, and by now, she had seen it, all the life and death decisions. The frantic the monitors in room 404 a quiet, mostly empty room had started beeping erratically. Sarah furrowed her brow. There was a patient in there, Mr. Jenkins, an elderly man who had been admitted earlier that day after a heart attack. His vitals had been stable, and everything seemed normal. But now, the monitors were flashing with alarm, and the quiet moments when a patient slipped away, unnoticed, into the cold embrace of death. The voice was quiet, strained, almost desperate, but unmistakably real. She swung around to face Mr. Jenkins, who had not moved. Yet the voice continued, now louder, echoing through the room. She turned toward the corner of the room, but saw nothing. Only the shadows that clung to the walls, the same ones that had been there when she walked in. But tonight was different. There was something in the air, an unspoken heaviness that Sarah couldn't quite place. The machines started to hum loudly, rattling in their stands. Sarah's head began to spin. Was she imagining this? Had exhaustion finally gotten to her, or was something else at play? No, it was coming from the corner of the room. The whispering grew louder, almost frantic, as if it was circling around her. She turned back to Mr. Jenkins. His chest rose and fell slowly, his breathing normal. He was still unconscious, unaware of the strange disturbance. From the shadows that seemed to stretch just a little too far in the dim light, the voice cried again, and this time, it wasn't just a whisper, it was a scream. The chill in the room deepened, and Sarah spun around to see a figure standing at the foot of Mr. Jenkins' bed. The figure was dark, its features indistinct, but it was unmistakably the Ritz form shifting, its presence undeniable, an agonized plea that seemed to claw its way into her mind. But when she touched a handle, the voice spoke once more, louder, clearer, more forceful than before. It wasn't the usual fatigue she felt after a long shift. The air inside was cold, unnaturally so, and the room seemed darker than usual, the lights flickering just slightly. Mr. Jenkins lay motionless in his bed, his eyes closed, his face pale. The beeping from the machines was frantic, now faster than it should have been, the rhythm completely out of sync with his condition. This was something else. His heart rate was steady, blood pressure was fine, and his oxygen levels were where they needed to be. Confused, Sarah bent down to adjust the machine, but the beeping stopped suddenly. Just as she exhaled a sigh of relief, a cold, unnatural chill swept through the room. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. It was almost as if the ICU itself was holding its breath. Sarah was finishing her rounds when she noticed something odd. Sarah rushed into the room, her heart racing. She checked his vitals again, but everything seemed normal. There was a faint sound, almost like a whisper, barely audible. It wasn't Mr. Jenkins. "Help me." Sarah's pulse quickened. She took a step forward, cautiously, her hands trembling as she reached for the light switch. The room brightened, but the whispering voice remained. "Help me." Sarah's eyes darted around the room in panic. The walls felt too close. The air was too cold. She couldn't breathe. "Help me." Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and the temperature dropped even further. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she reached for the door. "She's here. ... She's coming for you. ... Her heart stopped. In that moment, Sarah felt a bone-deep terror, like something was watching her from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. The room seemed to close in on her, and the figure took a step forward. The walls, the machines, the air, everything felt wrong. And the figure, the shadow at the foot of the bed, was the source of it. It was calling to her, beckoning her closer, urging her to step into its dark embrace. It was then that Sarah realized it wasn't just the voice, it was the entire room, now merging with the figure's cold, dark presence. "She's coming for you, ... the voice repeated. Panic surged within Sarah. She bolted from the room, slamming the door behind her. She gasped for air, her legs weak as she leaned against the wall for support. She still felt the weight of the shadows that lingered in that room. She needed time to rest, to regain her strength. But even as she closed her eyes to sleep, she could still hear the whispers, soft, distant, but always there, and she knew she couldn't return to face them alone. The whispers, the coldness, the figure, it wasn't just a nightmare. It was a warning. But Sarah's eyes were wide, and her hands shook as she grabbed a pen and scrolled down a note. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her. Had stress finally taken its toll on her mind? But deep inside, she knew what she had felt, what she had experienced was real. Something that had been awakened in room 404. She couldn't go back in there. She couldn't face whatever it was that had called to her. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend what had just happened. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It lingered, hanging over her like a heavy cloak. The ICU, the familiar walls she had worked in for years, suddenly felt alien to her. Something was wrong, something had crossed over into this world, something that didn't belong. She couldn't explain it, but she knew it was real. That thing in room 404 wasn't just a figment of her imagination. The whispers continued that night, carried by the cold air that seemed to seep through the walls. As she walked down the hall to the nurse's station, she passed several other nurses, each one moving as if nothing had happened. "I need a break," she wrote. "I don't know what's going on, but I need to leave." She handed the note to her supervisor, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Sarah wasn't sure what she expected. Was she overreacting? When she finally left the ICU that morning, the sun had begun to rise, but she didn't feel comforted. The next day, Sarah was sent home on leave. "She's here. She's coming for you, ... It was an ordinary Thursday night in the ICU, or at least it should have been. The beeping of machines, the quiet rustle of papers, and the soft hum of fluorescent lights above created an environment that felt oddly comforting to Nurse Emily. But there was still a faint glimmer of hope that he might recover. His condition was stable, though his breathing was labored, and he was unconscious. Who had worked in this unit for over 5 years. Night shifts were routine, and as exhausting as they were, Emily was used to them. She had seen trauma, life and death situation, and the worst of human suffering. But there was something different about tonight. A new patient had been admitted just a few hours, a Mr. Albrecht, a middle-aged man who had suffered a massive stroke. His prognosis was grim. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking as she turned it on. The beam of light cut through the dark, and she took slow, measured steps toward the door. Emily had been assigned to monitor his vitals during her shift, along with several other patients. Everything had been quiet, the night uneventful until the strange occurred. It started with the lights flickering, a voice barely audible, like a soft breeze. At first, Emily thought it was just a malfunction, a glitch in the hospital's aging wiring, but the flickering didn't stop. It came in waves. The voice had come from Mr. Albrecht's bed. She turned quickly, shining the flashlight on him. His eyes were closed, his body still. She rushed to his side, checking his vitals again. It wasn't coming from the room's walls. It wasn't coming from the machines. It was coming from somewhere else. Everything seemed normal, but the voice had been so real. She had heard it clearly, and it hadn't come from the machines. It was a human voice, desperate and pleading, like a slow pulse that seemed to match the beeping of the heart monitor. Each time the lights dimmed, the room grew colder, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But there, it was a movement in the corner of the room. Emily stood frozen, her pulse quickening. She glanced around, but the room was empty except for Mr. Albrecht. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. It's probably just fatigued, she reasoned. But her instincts told her something was wrong, and Emily noticed it immediately. She hadn't turned on the air conditioning, and the central heating had been working fine. So why was it so cold? She rubbed her arms for warmth and went to check the temperature. It was fine, yet the chill remained. She glanced at Mr. Albrecht, still lying motionless in his bed. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, but as she watched him, something caught her eye a shift in the shadows. It was brief. As she turned back to the monitors, the lights flickered again, this time going completely out. The room plunged into darkness. That's when she heard it. A faint whisper, "Help me, ... please." Emily froze. Am I hearing things? Emily thought, her mind clouded with exhaustion. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. Please, help me, help me. Emily's heart raced as the voice continued, almost as if it was circling around her. Just then, the lights flickered back on, and the temperature in the room shot up, as if the chill had never existed. The room was now unnaturally warm. Emily wiped the sweat from her brow, her mind spinning. Was it stress? Was she hallucinating? She had been up for over 16 hours, after all, but the voice continued. She's here. She's coming. Emily's blood ran cold as she turned toward the corner of the room where the shadow had shifted earlier. A figure dark, indistinct, stood at the edge of her vision. The woman's gaze empty and hollow locked onto hers, and Emily felt a chill that pierced her very soul. The figure moved toward her, slowly, deliberately. Her face was hidden in shadow, but Emily could sense the pain, the anguish in her presence. It wasn't like any physical touch she had felt before. It was as though the woman's hand was cold and dead. The woman was gone, yet still, it burned with an unnatural energy. It wasn't clear at first, but as her eyes adjusted, the form became more defined. The figure was a woman, her features blurry, her form hazy like smoke. She seemed to be staring directly at Emily, but when the other nurses arrived, everything seemed normal. Mr. Albrecht's vitals were back to baseline, and the room felt warmer, safer. No one else felt the chill or saw the shadow, and Emily wondered if anyone would believe her if she told them what had just happened. She didn't know what had just happened, but she knew it wasn't her imagination. There was something else in that room. Emily couldn't explain it, but she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the presence in the room had been waiting for the right moment. Something that had been there with Mr. Albrecht, something dark and malevolent. The hair on the back of Emily's neck stood up. She turned toward Mr. Albrecht again, feeling a shiver run down her spine. This time, something was different. The monitors were no longer steady. She stepped back, eyes wide. It had come for a reason, and the whispers still echoed in her mind, a reminder of what she had witnessed. She had felt it, had seen it, and she knew whatever had been waiting for Mr. Albrecht, whatever had called to her, was still out there, and it wasn't finished yet. She had seen patients in similar states unconscious, barely clinging to life, but this was different. His fingers moved again, jerking unnaturally, as if responding to something invisible. The heart rate showed rapid fluctuations, erratic spikes. Emily rushed to his side and checked the chart. His pulse was irregular, his oxygen levels dipping dangerously low, but there was still no physical sign of distress. His body remained still. As she adjusted the ventilator, something strange happened. Mr. Albrecht's hand twitched. It was so subtle, but Emily noticed it immediately. "She's coming," the voice repeated. This time, it was loud. The whispering intensified, merging with a faint, sorrowful sob. "Help me, ... please. She's coming, ... Emily's heart thudded in her chest. She couldn't breathe. She had to leave, but her legs wouldn't move. "Help me," the voice repeated, now louder than before, almost a scream. The figure reached out with a hand, and suddenly, Emily felt a cold, clammy grip on her wrist. In a panic, Emily ripped her wrist free, stumbling backward. The lights flickered again, the temperature plummeted, and the shadow in the corner dissipated. Emily gasped for breath, clutching her chest. Just then, the beeping from Mr. Albrecht's monitor grew steady again. His heart rate had returned to normal. He was stable, almost too stable. She quickly called for assistance. That night, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in room 404 wasn't finished. Nurse Rachel had been working the night shift in the ICU for over 8 years. In that time, she had experienced more than her fair share of difficult patients, heart-stopping moments, and the odd, unsettling situation. And the ICU was quieter than usual. The steady rhythm of heart monitors, the whir of ventilators, and the occasional soft cough from a patient were the only sounds breaking the silence. Rachel had just finished checking in on her patients when she noticed something strange. The air in the room felt heavier, as if a weight had been placed on her shoulders, but nothing quite like this. Her flashlight beam illuminating the woman's hand as it twitched again. "Thompson," a faint whisper, so soft, so quiet, she could barely make it out. Rachel whispered, her voice laced with concern. "Can you hear me?" She checked for a pulse, a response, anything. But there was nothing. Mrs. Thompson's eyes remained shut, her body still, as if locked in a deep, unnerving trance. It was just past 3 a.m. The voice had come from Mrs. Thompson's mouth. It wasn't just a groan or a sigh, but a clear, desperate plea for help. Rachel's pulse quickened, and her hand shook as she placed it on the woman's shoulder. Nurse Kevin, asking him to come to room 213. As she waited, the air seemed to grow heavier, the room closing in on her. The whispering grew louder, the words becoming clearer. She gently shook Mrs. Thompson, but there was no reaction. It was room 213. Rachel quickly grabbed her flashlight and hurried down the dimly lit hallway, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty corridors. The room felt unnaturally cold, the temperature dropping sharply as soon as Rachel entered. She shivered, but she quickly dismissed it as the usual chill of a late-night shift. The machines hummed softly, and the flickering fluorescent lights overhead added to the eerie atmosphere. She pushed open the door to Mrs. Thompson's room, and was immediately struck by an overwhelming sense of unease. Just the machines and the sleeping woman in the bed. She was beginning to doubt her senses. Was it fatigue from the long hours, or was something truly wrong? She glanced at the monitor beside her desk. Room 213 had been quiet for hours. The temperature dropped even further, and Rachel felt a shiver crawl up her spine. The patient, Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman in her late 70s, was stable after a major surgery. She had been under Rachel's care for the past few days, and seemed to be improving until now. The monitor beside Rachel's desk buzzed loudly, jolting her from her thoughts. The heart rate was stable, her oxygen levels normal. No alarms, no signs of distress. But as Rachel stood there, she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. Mrs. Thompson's hand was twitching, not just a simple tremor, but a sudden, jerking motion. It was as though her body was responding to something unseen. Mrs. Thompson was still in bed, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow but steady. Everything appeared normal at first glance, but there was something wrong. Rachel checked the monitor at Mrs. Thompson's bedside, her hands moving quickly over the controls. Rachel leaned in closer. "Mrs." There was no response, but that's when Rachel noticed something even more disturbing. "Help me." Rachel froze. "Mrs. Thompson, wake up," Rachel urged, her voice more insistent now. Again, nothing. Suddenly, the room seemed to darken. The lights flickered above her, dimming, then brightening again, casting strange shadows on the walls. The whispering came again, louder this time. "She's coming. She's here." Rachel's breath hitched as she turned to look around the room, but there was no one else there. She grabbed her phone and texted her colleague, "Help me. She's here." Rachel's pulse raced as her eyes darted around the room, but no one was there. The darkness seemed to deepen, and the shadows in the corners of the room twisted unnaturally. Rachel stepped back, startled, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She glanced at the woman in the bed. Her eyes were still closed, her breathing steady. She felt like she was being watched, like something or someone was lurking just out of sight. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. "She's coming for you. She's coming for all of you." Then, without warning, Mrs. Thompson's hand jerked once more, this time with such force that it knocked over a nearby cup of water. "Mrs. Thompson," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" It was then that Rachel noticed the strangest thing. As her flashlight flickered, she saw something move in the shadows behind the bed. Something tall, a figure perhaps, the shape of a woman, barely visible, standing in the corner of the room. The figure was still, its features obscured by the darkness, but Rachel could feel its presence. She could feel the weight of its gaze. In that moment, the door burst open, and Nurse Kevin rushed in. But before she could dial, the figure in the corner of the room moved. The room was quiet once more, the cold lifting, the shadows receding. Mrs. Thompson lay there, peacefully asleep, no sign of the horrific figure that had just stood before her. A woman. She was standing right there. The whispering intensified, now joined by a soft, eerie moan. The ICU was quiet again, but for Rachel, the silence was more terrifying than ever. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She reached for her phone to call for help. It was so fast, faster than humanly possible, and it seemed to glide across the floor. Its footsteps silent, its form growing clearer. The woman in the bed stirred again, her eyes fluttering open. But they weren't Mrs. Thompson's eyes. They were dark black as night staring directly at Rachel. The woman's mouth twisted into a grin, an unnatural, wide smile. The figure, a woman in a hospital gown, appeared at the foot of Mrs. Thompson's bed, her face still hidden in shadow. Rachel stumbled back, her legs weak, her mind scrambling for an explanation. Was this a hallucination? Was it exhaustion playing tricks on her? But then the figure spoke, her voice, not the soft whisper of Mrs. Thompson, but a chilling, cold tone. "Has come." The room grew impossibly cold, the air thick with dread. Rachel screamed, stepping back as the figure advanced. "Rachel, what's going on? Are you okay?" Rachel's voice caught in her throat as she turned toward him. But when she looked back at the bed, the woman, whatever she was gone. Kevin looked at her in confusion. "What happened?" Rachel's voice faltered as she pointed to the bed. I saw something. Someone was here." Kevin checked the monitors and Mrs. Thompson's vitals. Everything was normal, stable. Rachel swallowed hard, her heart still racing. "Real," she whispered. "I wasn't imagining it." But when she looked again at the empty corner of the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching her. The night shift in the ICU was always quiet, but tonight, Nurse Ava couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't the usual sense of exhaustion that came with working long hours now. This was different. Something in the air felt thick, oppressive, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. Ava had been working in this particular ICU for 4 years. She was familiar with the ebb and flow of patients, the constant monitoring, the tiny victories and tragic losses. But tonight, the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. As she walked down the long, dimly lit hallway, she passed the usual room's patients, their rhythmic beeps and hums, the soundtrack of the ICU. She wasn't sure why, but it was as if her feet were moving on their own. But the coldness in the room seemed to press in on her, making it difficult to breathe. She walked over to the window and looked out into the night sky, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. When she reached the door, she hesitated. Her heart was racing, her palms slightly sweaty. She knew there was no reason to feel this when nothing unusual had happened, but the presence of the room seemed to call to her. Ava stepped back, reaching for the light switch, but before she could touch it, a voice, faint but unmistakable, came from the corner of the room. Her heart lurched in her chest. She spun around quickly, but the room was still empty. It sounded like Mr. Haribo. She knew it was impossible. He had passed away days ago, but still, she couldn't ignore the gut-wrenching feeling that something was deeply wrong. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as she turned back to the window. Nothing had changed, but there was one room she kept avoiding. Room 412. But despite her rational thoughts, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Room 412 had been empty for days. The patient, a middle-aged man named Mr. Harris, had passed away after a long battle with cancer. There was nothing to suggest that anything supernatural was at play. But as Ava stepped inside, she felt it again, the cold, the heaviness in the air. She felt a cold draft brush against her skin, and as she reached out toward the chair in the corner of the room, she thought she saw a faint shadow move just at the edge of her vision. The sense of being watched, more desperate. She couldn't explain it, couldn't understand what was happening, but she knew she had to leave. She turned toward the door, but before she could take another step, the voice spoke again, this time louder, more demanding. Ava had been part of the team that cared for him during his final days, and despite the emotional toll of his loss, she had moved on. But something about that room lingered. Ava couldn't explain it, but every time she walked past, a wave of unease washed over her. The air around room 412 felt colder, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting unsettling shadows along the hallway. She felt the weight of something unseen pressing against her, as if the very room itself was alive with dark energy. Ava shook her head, trying to push the feeling aside, but it didn't go away. It was as if someone was still in that room, waiting. Around midnight, after completing her rounds, Ava found herself walking toward room 412 once again. Taking a deep breath, Ava opened the door. The room was exactly as it had been left. A single bed, an empty chair beside it, and the faint smell of antiseptic in the air. She turned on the light, scanning the room. It was empty. That's when she saw it. In the reflection of the window, she saw a figure standing behind her. Her mind raced. It's just exhaustion. I'm overworked. I'm seeing things. The lights above flickered again, plunging the room into sleep. Ava froze, her body stiff with fear. The voice was low, weak, almost a whisper, but it was there, clear as day. Help me. The voice repeated, and this time, it was louder. Ava's hands trembled as she moved toward the corner where the voice seemed to be coming from. Who's there? Ava whispered, her voice cracking with fear. There was no response, but the air in the room thickened, the atmosphere oppressive. Ava stepped back quickly, her breath coming in short bursts. Don't leave. Ava's heart skipped a beat. Her legs froze in place. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The voice, it wasn't just a whisper anymore. The bed, which had been neatly made when Ava entered, was now rumpled, as though someone had been lying there. A tall, shadowy figure in a hospital gown, its features obscured by darkness. The figure's face was hidden, but Ava could feel its presence. Its gaze locked onto her, and standing beside the bed, facing her, was a figure. It was right behind her, in her ear. The chill in the room deepened, and the air grew heavy, like a storm was about to break. Suddenly, the lights above her blinked once more, and when they flickered back on, the room was different. Ava's blood ran cold. It was the shadow she had seen in the window, but now, it was more solid, more defined. She stumbled down the hall, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't human. There have been reports from other staff members, too. People hear voices, see shadows. It's been like that ever since Mr. Harris passed. Maybe it's time to take a break, Ava. Get some rest. Don't go near that room again. Her mind was a blur. She couldn't process what had just happened. She could still feel the coldness of the room, the weight of the figure's presence, and the lingering whisper of the voice that had pleaded for help. Who are you? Ava whispered, her voice trembling. And no matter how much she wanted to forget, she knew she would never be able to. She grabbed the phone and dialed her supervisor, her hands still shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it moved toward her, its movements slow, deliberate. Ava stepped back, her hands shaking as she reached for the door. She couldn't stay in this room any longer. She had to leave. But when she reached for the doorknob, the figure was right behind her, its cold breath against her neck. Live, now, the voice hissed. Ava screamed, her body jolting in fear. She wrenched the door open and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind her. When she reached the nurse's station, Ava looked around for her colleagues, but the place was eerily empty. The supervisor picked up on the second ring. Ava, what's wrong? I saw something in room 412, Ava stammered. I heard a voice, and I saw a figure. Her supervisor paused for a moment before responding. Ava, you're not the first to mention strange things happening in that room. Ava's heart sank. She hadn't imagined it. The presence in that room, the coldness, the whispering voice, it was real. Her supervisor's voice soft, but as Ava walked away from the nurse's station, she couldn't shake the feeling that room 412 was still calling her. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Each of your stories adds another layer to our growing community of horror enthusiasts. And if you think someone else might enjoy a good scare, don't forget to share this video with them. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling stories. And remember, sometimes the scariest tales are the ones that could happen to any of us. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, if you dare.